Hi everyone. Today we'll continue with the perspectives on environmentalism and next to what we have discussed in the last lectures on the ecofeminism, we would be looking at eco-marxism, which can also be known as the eco-marxist perspective, and more importantly how environment and ecology can be seen from the Marxist perspective or framework. So what we're going to do in this class is to critically look at some of the works of Marx and more importantly the works which is carried forward by Foster. So most of our discussion will delve around the discussion which has been posited and carried forward by Foster. Now what is this particular term or concept called eco-Marxism? Eco-Marxism is a political ideology that fuse the Marxist doctrine of anti-capitalism with ecology, anti-globalizations and various pro-environment policies. So the birth of eco-Marxism was likely to likely due to a vacuum on in the science discourse in that ecology does not have a social analysis. So eco-Marxists view the expansion of capitalism through globalization as one of the root causes of environmental degradations, war, inequality and poverty. Now in the eco-Marxist thought, we would also be looking at how alienation and then the relation between materialism and how Marxist and nature evolve over a period of time through the process of production. So in some sense we are also looking at the materialist conception of history, which Marx has discussed at a particular length. Now one may also wonder that to link Marxism and ecological transition might at the first instant seem like trying to bridge two entirely different knowledge systems, or maybe rather discourses, because it have its own history and logic, that is, which delve around which delve around the class relations, as we all know what Marxism is all about, and the other that is ecology or ecological thought, which talks about the relation between the humans and the environment. Now if you look at Marx in his Capital Volume 1, where I quote, "All progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the earth not only of robbing the laborer but also of robbing the soil, and all progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards running the lasting sources of that fertility." Now Marx also in some sense foresee the consequences of industrializations and the way in which how exploitation of not just human labor but exploitations of nature has taken place as a result of the use of science and technology vis-a-vis industrialization, and how many of the developed countries have actually used or exploit science and technology to further their interest, and in the process it also led to the creating a binary and at the same time exhausting like for instance the fertility of the soil. So therefore it is in some way eco-Marxism is also in some way a critical thinking of trying to looked at or analyzed the way in which how human nature relationships has evolved in historical epochs, and one has to really see that how the relation between man and nature has has evolved, and then the kind of like strengths and the various dichotomies which emerges needs to be critically also looked into. And Marx has also goes on to the way in which how there is a rift in metabolism of the food chain system, and thereby it has caused enormous problem to the mother earth. Now, if one has to looked at Marx in a much more, or read Marx in a much more critical sense, we can in some way also see that how Marx's notion of materialism, or for that matter the insights of Marx's theory of history, is pretty much important for our understanding of human and nature, and thereby putting them in eco-Marxist framework. Now, as we all know, humans are natural and also a social being, and we are pretty much part and parcel of nature, as to the extent that we are a social being. And humans also through their relationship with the way in which how we engage with nature transform, that is through our action, that is labor, by using the forces of production, for example tools and technology. Now, if you see in a much more deeper light about Marx's notion of what the relationship between labor, material and art, where I quote that Marx talks about labor is the father of the material wealth and the art its mother. So therefore, in the Marxist framework, human and natures are two principal agents in the creation of wealth. Thus, it is important for us to have both of them under control, right? So Marx also in some sense highlighted that the history of nature and the history of man are dependent on each other as long as man exists. So therefore, it also talks about the co-evolutions and the coexistence. Now, at this point, it is also important to look into what Marx has coined by the term called the pretty much concept, which is social metabolism. So this particular concept has its origin, which dates back to the 1850s, and which of course has occupied one of the main important place in his economics works. Now, how does Marx make sense of labor, which I have pointed out that is because labor again plays an important role in terms of transforming the nature, because man enter into relationship with nature because of our labor, that is through our actions. So Marx defined the labor process itself as a way in which man through his own actions mediates, regulates and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. Human production also in some sense operated within what he called the universal metabolism of nature. So this very concept, the universal metabolism of nature, or maybe also known as social metabolism, have in some sense contribute an invaluable for our understanding in terms of the relationship between the social and social productive systems and vis-a-vis capitalism. So eco-Marxism also needs to be situated in terms of how capitalism is being questioned. So in some sense, it is interrogating the very nature of how capitalism evolved and how capitalism has brought the kind of the very sense of othering, that is putting nature as something which is, alien or different from the human. So this very approach in some sense tries to look at the human social relation to nature, and which of course is pretty much deeply intertwined with Marx's critique of the capitalist class society. Now, for those of you who are not very familiar with what Marx talks about in his class struggle, because he outlined that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Now, if you go back to the history, that is since the hunting-gathering society, or maybe vaguely known as the primitive society, there exists a kind of the post-hunting and gathering society. There are two pertinent class which are existence in any known society, that is beginning from the feudal society, and then we have the slavery system, and then also in the agricultural society there are the serf and the peasants, and slaves and the masters, and again in the industrial society we have the capitalist mode of production, which in some sense have two forms of classes, that is the bourgeois and the proletariat, that is the capitalists who own the means of productions, and the proletariat who constitute the working class. So other than the hunting and gathering society, or maybe the primitive society, which believe in the idea of egalitarianism, other than that there is the resemblance of two forms of classes. So there is this evolving system of class struggle which has been espoused by Marx in his explanations of the materialist conception of history, and more importantly how class struggle has emerged. So having said that, we are in some way now familiar that the way in which the capitalist class society has also engages with, so which in some sense have give us the idea of how historical materialism has contributed to the ecological crisis which we have encountered for the past few decades, and till now at this point of time. Now, the concept of the very terminology dialectics of nature is of course pretty much more close to the work of Engels, and even when Marx and Engels have put forward and propagate this particular dialectics of nature. Now, what does this dialectics means? Because why is it important to also familiarize ourselves with dialectics? Because the very way in which how ecological crisis is being witnessed as a result of capitalism is because the very notion of this dialectics is being in some way sidelined or destroyed. So Engels in some sense tries to argue that dialectical reasoning, that is it tries to look into the way in which how there is a contradictory or maybe incompatible development within the same relation emerges. That is the interpretations of opposites. So therefore there is a quantitative change which give rise to the qualitative transformation and thereby processes the historical transcendence. And it is important for us to engage with this because it is essential to understand the complexity and dynamism of the physical world. Now, Marx has also, in some way contributed immensely in terms of explaining or making sense of the ecological economics approach. That is, ecological economics took shape from a critique of production and particularly the capitalist commodity productions. So all commodities were in some way conceived as a living, as having the dual forms of the use and the exchange value. So use value and exchange value, which in some way is related to the the natural material conditions and monetary exchange value. So the capitalists, or maybe from a capitalist point of view, nature is something which is considered to be having just a use value and exchange value, and so is the human labor. So apart from that, serving that utilitarian perspective, it does not really have a value in itself. So therefore, human labor and nature are reduced to that particular set, that is which have just a use value and an exchange value. So Marx also in some sense tries to explain the kind of antagonistic tension which arises between the use value and exchange value, because as both in some way are providing a kind of internal contradictions of capitalism, and which of course has a conflict with its external natural environment. So therefore, if you look at the works of Marx, he insisted that nature and labor together constitute the dual sources of wealth. Now, by incorporating, that is by taking on the labor, that is the human services, into economic value calculations, capitalism ensured that the ecological and social costs of production would be excluded from the bottom line. So distinctive characteristic of Marxian ecological theory then is that it tries to give utmost attention to the unequal ecological exchange or ecological imperialism. So we can sort of, like, for instance, looked at that one country can actually exploit another ecologically. Okay, so for instance, taking the examples of England, which is a pioneer in terms of where industrializations has begun, and England had engaged indirectly by exporting the soil of Ireland, for example. So in that process, it undermined the long-term fertility of the Irish agriculture. So one can actually see the kind of injustice which are being witnessed over here. Now, many of the Marxian theories also have extended the analysis of this ecological imperialism, that is by seeing it as integral to all attempts to address the ecological problem. Now, how then we looked at the way in which how Marx tries to link uh, with nature, or how Marx tries to make sense of this ecological thought. Now, the Marxian approaches to the ecological crisis and the socio-ecological transformation necessary for its resolution have evolved rapidly in recent decades. So by creating the basis for a much more powerful and collective struggle for transition in which consumerism, individualism, and dominations of nature are replaced with a new trait, that is the quality of life, human solidarity, and in a sense ecological sensibility. So many Marxist theories also recently have given equal importance to ecological sustainability by building on Marx environmental critique of capitalism and his pioneering vision of sustainable human development. So in some way, the ecological Marxists, or the people who tends to thinkers who subscribe themselves as the eco-Marxists, made an attempt to unearth the deep ecological roots of Marx thought, and they attempts to show that how Marx has brought an environmental perspective to in some way address the overarching questions of social transformation. So one can really look at the evolutions of Marxian ecology in that sense. Now, one of the main problems, or the major problem with modern ecological thought, is that it is considered to be assumed to be far too idealistic. Now, if we revisit the works of Marx and Engels, their idea of ecology, or their notion of ecology, is pretty much rooted in their understanding or explanations of materialism, that the natural world is the foundations for all that exist. So therefore, for them, physical reality is important. That is, the physical reality actually have existed prior to our thought, right? So therefore, in some way, we can also say that our existence in some way is because of the physical reality, right? So therefore, physical reality, according to Marx, is that it is independent of and prior to thought. So matter is important, right? So therefore, if one goes on looking at Marx critically, and by considering the works of Foster, Marx social ecology in some way intends to bring Marx to the or serious attention to the ecologies, that because Marxist theory for in some way can provide an important alternative or insight to critically look at the ecological crisis of our time. Now, at this point, it is also important for us to critically look at what materialism is all about. Now, as Marx has outlined that the physical reality is important and independent of our thought, that materialism is a theory of nature, is that it has persisted down to our time. Now, Russell has again observed that early in this century, in spite of the fact that few eminent philosophers has advocated it. Now, in its most general sense, materialism claims that the origins and development of whatever exists is dependent on nature and on our nature and matter. So that is a level of the physical reality that is independent and prior to our thought. So Marx's idea or notion of this materialist conception of history focus principally on the practical materialism, that is the relations of man and nature were practical from the outset, that is human enter into relationship with nature through their labor, that is through action. For instance, in the agriculture or farming society, human enter into relationship with nature by using plow or maybe a spade or maybe a hoe. So it sort of engage or enter into a relationship through the dint of his or her labor. So therefore, the idea of this relationship is established by human action alone. So therefore, according to Marx, through this action we transform our relation to the world and also transcend our alienation from it, that is creating our own distinct human nature relations. So all this in some sense can be encapsulated by the idea of the material praxis. So material conception of history again for Marx is important because through that we could actually see the evolution of the human natural or human nature relations. Now, as we all know, we are also in some way we agreed to the fact that man engage upon nature and thereby we our means of lives and livelihood are attained by engaging with nature. Therefore, man lives from nature. That is, we can also further elaborate by saying that nature is his body and he must maintain a continued dialogue with it if he is to survive, right? Therefore, man's physical and mental life to link to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for we are a part of nature, because human belongs to the nature, not that nature belongs to us. So this could be seen from the early writings of Marx. Now again, human beings are are pretty much part of nature, and nature in some sense on the other hand provides the material needs, that is the material means for the life of human. For instance, the resources such as water, food, sun and shelter, so on and so forth, are some of the basic needs that nature has provided to human. And but the very way in which how we relate with nature, that is the harmonious relationship which have existed, for instance in the hunting gathering society or maybe in primitive communism, is something which has evolved over time, and thereby as a the exploitations of the tools and technology which we use, it becomes finer and finer, and then the appropriations of nature also takes place, thereby causing a kind of imbalances and crisis which we are in some way encountering. Now we as a human also relate to nature through the production of goods as well as the reproduction of species. So these are part and parcel process of how human relates to nature. And also it is through this particular production process that human transformed nature into products for human use. So on the other hand, the reproduction process both assures the continuations of society as well as the regulations of the amount of resources required from the environment. Now at this point we can also in some way bring to our attention that nature has enough of resources to satisfy our needs, but the problem arises when the need is being replaced with greed. So therefore the harmonious relationship which exists or have in some way is being spoiled or interrupted when it is replaced by the notion of greed. Now if we further looked at the works of Marx and Engels, they wrote that man must be in a position to live in order to be able to make history, but life involves before anything else eating and drinking, housing, clothing, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the basic elements which are important for the existence of humans. Now the first historical act which is being seen from the works of Marx is that the production of the means to satisfy these needs, that is clothing, fooding, and so on and so shelter, so on and so forth, which we have already underlined. So therefore the very first act, that is the historical act, is thus the productions of these means to satisfy these needs, that is the productions of the material life itself. And then therefore this itself is a historical act, and which forms the fundamental conditions of all history, and as we have evolved over successive generations and thousands and hundreds of years, we sort of like engages upon to merely fulfill or sustain human life. So the very idea of accumulations, or maybe the very idea of surplus, profit, so on and so forth, was something which was unknown in the earlier forms of society, for example in hunting and gathering. So the hunting and gathering society again is it sets out one very important epochs of history, for the simple reason that human society hunt and gather food which meets their basic needs. So it was more or less based on the idea of subsistence. So they depend on nature for simply to sustain their life. So the very production of life, that is both one's owned in labor and the fresh life in like for example procreation, appears as twofold relations. On the one hand as something which is natural, and on the other hand as a social relation. So one can critically again look back at the past history in that sense. So then materialism in the successive history makes life and society possible. Okay, and as we have pointed out that it is the first historical act, that is man entering into relationship with nature. So by means of which that is women also in some way engage in manipulating the natural environment to obtain, for example, the essential goods, and which perhaps is the foundations of Marx's social theory, and this would in some way means that relating to the natural world through the production and reproductions. So therefore there is these two twin process of, you know, the natural and the social relations which have been, you know, coexisted, which have co-evolved in the historical period of time. Now, one very peculiar thing which needs to be, you know, pointed out here is that if you look at the works of Marx in his you know, philosophical manuscript, which was published way back in 1844, he come up with this, you know, developed this concept of, you know, alienated labor, which is very much part and parcel of capitalism or capitalist mode of production. Now, interestingly, it is also important to see that the very idea which is, you know, being witnessed in the works of Marx is that it view that in history that in which the exploitations of workers and of nature go hand in hand. So on the one hand, the exploitations of human labor or the workers and the exploitation of nature are actually, you know, one of the fundamental source of alienation. Okay, that means estrangement, the root cause or the starting point of our estrangement from nature. So therefore, how does this, you know, alienations of sense of estrangement, you know, arises? Now, in the eco-Marxist thought, alienations refers to the separations that human beings have under capitalism, the way, the extent to which they suffer from. Okay, through that, because capitalism itself is pretty much exploitative in nature. So this sense of alienation or alienation is pretty much experienced in the form of, you know, human beings trying to distance from the, you know, products of their own labor, right? Because what they produce usually, the final product is being owned and controlled by the by other classes, that is the capitalists or the bourgeois. So therefore, being distanced from the product of their own labor and being distant from nature themselves and, you know, other human beings. So therefore, this very self-alienation in some sense is the root of old forms of, you know, alienations. So in some sense, humans are, you know, part of nature, and humans are part of what they produce, that is the materials to produce, the materials produced come from, you know, nature. Now other humans are also, you know, part of nature. So to be separate from these things is to be alienated from our human nature and nature as a whole. So further, if we, you know, looked at in a capitalist, you know, viewpoint, the alienations of the working class is an individual problem, whereas from the standpoint of the eco-Marxist view, it is a social issue, because since through labor we produce things, and since in, you know, producing things we change the nature of what we are, then labor is a means of, you know, creating what we are, that is of the sense of being self-creations. So therefore, in capitalism, workers through their labor produce things and that change themselves and nature. So therefore, in some way, eco-Marxism also seeks to emphasize that humans are, you know, part and parcel of nature, and nature is also a part of humans. and therefore the exploitations of one means the exploitations of the other, as they are linked, because you could see the interlinkages of human and nature. Now, as we have rightly pointed out that how the interrelationship exists between man and nature, because man lives on nature, and that also in some way means that nature is part of his body. Now, what happens in capitalism, again, as in addition to what I have pointed out, the way in which capitalism functions. Capitalism again also exploits the land and the people, and also sacrifices the interest of both for the pursuit of profit. So therefore, if one has to critically look at capitalism as such, capitalism tends to perceive the environment and also appropriate nature, and also forces us to in some way adopt, and there is this process of separations and alienation which involve. So therefore, we are in some way our relationships with we are cut off from the land and separated from nature and alienated from co-evolving with it. Now, one can also further say that the alienations from nature in some way is one of Marx's vital contributions to understanding of human nature relationship, because he in some way tries to highlight the long philosophical view or philosophical tradition of viewing human as separate and above the rest of nature, and he also asserts the necessity for both survival and spiritual well-being of a proper and active relationship with the rest of nature. And at the same time, he also recognizes this relationship in some way has gone wrong in the capitalist epoch. So one can further also say that the problem is capitalism and not humanity per se, because in some of the writings of Marx, again, he also developed his analysis with the very concept of like the mode of production. Now, each of the different forms of human society that have existed historically across the globe has its own way of organizing human labor to meet subsistence needs through work and with nature, and it's with its own specific way of distributing the results of labor. Now, again, if we looked at the works of the writings of Marx and Engels in the German ideology, for instance, which I have sort of like highlighted as an example so that we make sense or familiarize ourselves again. Now, where I quote, the essence of the fish is its being water, that is the essence of the fresh water. Fish is the water of a river, but the latter ceases to be the essence of the fish, and so is no longer suitable medium for existence, as the river is made to serve the industry. So in some way you could see the how the commodifications of nature in some way tends to disrupt the sense of metabolism, or the way in which how the relationship, the cordial relationship between human and nature, or maybe nature and nature again, is being disrupted as a result of this. Therefore, capitalist production in some way tends to disturb the metabolic interaction between man and the earth. That is, it prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements, which of course is consumed by man in the form of food and clothing, because it provides the basic needs in some way. So therefore one can perhaps again critically look at these very notions of how capitalism tends to further emphasize on this. So as I had pointed out, in the capitalist mode of production immediately undermines any attempt to explain our ecological predicament, because it always tries to give a larger emphasis or interest in terms of how we make sense of this, because capitalism to Marx seems to or appears to be unsustainable in the sense of the term. Now what then is capitalism, and why is it that capitalism is seen to be one of the root cause of not just the ecological crisis, but also which disrupts the metabolic relationship between human and nature, because capitalism is nothing but it propagate the very idea of not just appropriating nature, but also it tends to see things only from the use value and the exchange value. So therefore it also espouses the very idea of surplus or maybe profit. So therefore there is an intensive exploitations of people, and it has seen the very inhuman kind of relations of productions in the in historical societies. Now if we further looked at the works of Foster has contended that industrial technology and demographic factors are not simply the major cause of environmental destruction as such, while no doubt these material forces are intimately rooted in the social relations of production. And it also talks about the very expanding of accumulation. Now one can also further look at the way in which how demographic and technological forces are part and parcel to the way in which how capital or accumulation of capital is being carried forward. Now in one writing which I come across, it also talks about that overpopulation per se is not an issue, because that's a very narrow Malthusian view. Rather the problem is that the way in which how resources are being distributed in a very disordered manner, that is where resources are being concentrated in the hands of few people, and then few people are actually controlling or deriving profit from the resources. Now we can also further looked at that how capitalism is seen to be considered in terms of the worldwide phenomenon, in terms of both the peripheral and the coordinations, where there is an imbalances in terms of the core nations, that is the developed nations, which actually amass or exploited the resources of those peripheral nations, and because the peripheral nations are the ones who are underdeveloped and developing countries. So therefore the issue of the depletions and pollution, or maybe some other issues, are actually seen to be an inherent problem. And capitalism also is broadly based on the very idea of growth, and there is driving force behind this is also to commodify all goods and services, and also to create newer needs and luxuries in order to bring in the idea of consumerism, or maybe the level of consumption has multiplied and increased to a large extent. Because of this, urging needs and drive, the core nations have, a tremendous consumption rate of raw materials, and which of course is being provided by the peripheral nations. And you could actually see the nuances, or maybe the dichotomy between these two, that is the core and the peripheral nations, where there is imbalances in terms of the exchange and maybe the exploitations of raw materials. Now again, one can also see that the way in which expansions of these populations and industrial activity takes place, Foster further writes that the scale of these human economic processes began to, in some way question the ecological, cycles, and it also in some way invite the possibility of the planet-wide ecological disaster. So under this rules of human capital, and human societies have growth in both populations and the use of exploitations of technology like anything else. For example, the way in which mining or maybe extractions of raw materials have accelerated to a large extent. And growth, no doubt, is not inherent in the industrial production as such, because it also simply consists of the rational technologies and social practices to exploit the environment for human consumption or human use. Because the objectivity of capitalism, no doubt, is to maximize the rate of profit as quickly, as efficiently, and as possible. So it is a system of economic accumulation. So therefore one can actually see the pace of how exploitation and accumulation takes place, which is at a very fast pace. So people who are actually controlling these resources, or maybe the economic institutions in various places or avenues across the globe, in some way are committed to economic growth, and through the use of their power and influences, they have become an unquestioned goal of social life. But the serious environmental problems are not simply because of our numbers and consequent increase in the consumption and waste as such, but the type of technologies used, such as manufacturing goods, and the type of agriculture used are in some way are having an overarching environmental impact. So one of the main pertinent and important problems which needs to be identified is the drive for profit, which has actually led the capitalists to integrate science to the industrial production process. So therefore little attention is being paid to the environmental consequences, because as long as they derive certain profit, or maybe they are in a position to maximize profit out of it, they least bother, and they are not really concerned about the environmental consequences. And as we all know, like, the new technologies have replaced the older ones, and therefore one can actually see the way in which how new technologies in some way or the other satisfy the needs of the capitalists. And we could also see the in the past few decades, the way in which how the use of chemicals, for instance, and the fertility of the soil is being disrupted. So therefore one can again go back to how Marx talks about the social metabolism, and then the way in which there is a metabolism rift which occur as a result of this. Now, way back from the World War II, like capitalism has also employed science to develop a production system that is pretty much hostile and very much impactful to the environment. So therefore, a counter-ecological system of production is being into play. So as a result, capitalism has engages with extractions of raw materials as commodities, and it is always calculated in terms of the exchange value. So therefore, the profit making relation has become one of the sole connection between human beings and nature, and this means that while we can envision a more sustainable forms of technology that would solve much of the environmental problems, that is, the development and implementations of these technologies is blocked by the mode of production, that is by capitalism and the capitalists. So therefore, one has to really look into the way in which how decisions are being taken with regards to profitability and so on and so forth. Now, if we critically looked at the way in which this capitalism in some way has emerges and functions. Now, eco-marxism in some way views the ongoing environmental degradations as the result of a destructive economic and political system, that is capitalism. And the root cause of this social injustice and environmental degradation is a capitalist world where attainment of profit by any means is of course one of the guiding principles which is being carried forward and followed. So therefore, the eco-Marxist perspective is of the view that the force that is capitalism that subjugates the proletariat is the same force that subjugates and destroys nature or the earth, and its destruction will in some way usher in the emancipations of both, that is human and nature. So therefore, one of the problems which is alarming is that capitalism treats nature as the other, that is something which is different from human and which is external to the human existence, and nature is again perceived as something which is a free gift which can be used at their whims and fancies in order to achieve their hunger and greed. So it works of Burkett and Foster. It can be noted that capitalism's failures to incorporate into its value according and its tendency to confuse the value and wealth were the fundamental contradictions in the regime of the capital itself. So therefore, in this sense, Karl Marx in some way foresee that capitalism as a system depended on the accumulations of value, even if it was to the detriment of nature. So Marx's theory of this metabolic or social metabolism, which we has discussed, his idea of this metabolic rift grew out of a response to the 19th century crisis of soil fertility, and the problems accelerated in a very in an increasing scale, and a kind of disjuncture which is seen in the capitalist production, and which of course were pretty much systematically stressed by Marx way back in the mid 19th century. And the social ecologists who are being influenced by the works of Marx in some way have argued that capitalism has generated an acceleration of the human transformation of the earth system, which of course occur in like two important phases, that is the Industrial Revolution, which began at the end of the 18th century, and the rise of the monopoly of capitalism, particularly in its mature stage in the Second World War, which of course include and tries to mark in some way marks the development of the nuclear powered and the widespread commercial use of synthetic chemicals. Now in the book The Ecological Rift, Clark, York and Foster in some way integrated the Marxian metabolic rift analysis with the planetary boundaries framework by describing it as a series of rifts in the Earth systems. So in this view, today's planetary emergency related to crossing these boundaries, or maybe the way in which we can be termed as the global ecological rift, which of course refer to the disruptions and destabilizations of the human relationship to the planetary on a planetary scale, and which of course arises out of the capital accumulation endlessly. So it continues and it goes on. So therefore the continuous exponential economic growth cannot occur without expanding its Earth system. Therefore many of the developed and core nations in some way must move towards a stationary state or maybe a steady state economy, and which of course also required a shift to an economy without a net capital formation. So development, particularly in the rich economies, must assume a new form that is qualitative, collective and cultural, that give utmost importance to a sustainable human development and in harmony with Marx's original view of socialism. So such kind of shift that is from capital accumulation towards a system of meeting collective needs based on the very principles of enough is obviously impossible in any meaningful sense. What then is required at this point is that an ecological and social revolution that will in some way facilitate a society of ecological sustainability and substantive equality. So for many of the Marxist ecological thinkers, this very dire state of affairs has led to a development of two-stage strategy for ecological and social revolution. So the first stage focuses on what can be done now, and on what is being realistic in the short term under the present conditions, while necessarily going against the logic of capital accumulation. So on the other hand, the long-term goal of systematic transformation raises the issue of the second stage of ecological revolution. That is, one of the main primary questions, of course, is the historical conditions under which these changes is going to come about. So Marx referred to the environmental pressure of his days as an unconscious socialist tendency, which would require the associated producers to regulate the social metabolism with nature in a rational way. So this tendency, however, can only be result as the result of a great revolution carried out by the greater part of humanity, which would of course establish a much more egalitarian conditions and processes for governing the global society, and of course the requisite ecological, social and economic planning. So what we need today actually is, from the eco-Marxist perspective, is that an ecological revolution which is equivalent in depth and scope to those earlier transformations, which he of course in some way foresee in terms of explaining the capitalism few centuries back. Hence, revolutionary reconstitutions of a society at large, and that is by altering the social metabolic reproduction, would in some way provides the only alternative to the impending common ruin of the contending classes. So we have in some way tries to make sense of how Marx has at length talks about the very notions of how exploitation takes place, and how the exploitations of human labor in capitalism also in some way has an overarching impact on the exploitations of nature, which is of course seen as the twin process of exploitations, or maybe in terms of alienation. So therefore eco-marxism in some way tends to bring a new yield or an alternative thinking in terms of how we make sense of the environmental degradations which we are encountering. And further readings of this could in some way enhance our understanding, because my discussion is primarily based on the works of J.B. Foster, and one can have a much more broader and better understanding of eco-Marxism by looking at their works. So we will continue and look further about the different approaches of environmentalism in the next class. Thank you.